All right, here we go. Chapter 3, medical, legal, and ethical. We're going to talk about medical and legal more than anything else. Ethical is kind of on you all. Um, Morals and ethics are something that we kind of govern ourselves by and that our peers and other folks will measure us by, but it's a difficult thing to teach. That's kind of that affective domain we were talking about a little bit yesterday. So first things first, let's get into what our scope of practice is. Now, I see a lot of you guys did the chapter work and stuff last night. So somebody out there tell me, what is your scope of practice? Anybody? Nobody?
It's the
Obviously.
guideline that's uh like laid out for you by the state and your medical director for what you are allowed to do while working as an EMT.
There you go. It is really pretty much the rules of the game, right? Our scope of practice is going to be the things that we are allowed to do. Long story short, that textbook that we lunked down in front of you a couple of weeks ago is pretty much going to be your scope of practice. Now, there are some little bits and pieces and things that we need to know. Like, there are things in this book that are going to be outside of our scope of practice right now here in the great state of Massachusetts. Um, it's really just anything that you are trained to do and legally allowed and accepted to do. Speaking of legally, we'll talk about what some of our legal duties are. Legally speaking, here in Massachusetts, and we'll stick with Massachusetts at least for a little while, your care is defined by OEMS, your medical director, but legally speaking, you're not obligated to provide any sort of emergency medical service care or care as an EMT unless you're being paid. That is when you are legally obligated to commit your duties as an EMT. So once you punch in for work, it is time to be an EMT. As far as legally speaking for your scope of practice, well, it is what is deemed acceptable for you to provide as treatments. You can't do things that are outside what you're allowed to do. Your standard of care, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit more of the gray area. Standard of care means, was it reasonable? Because just because we're allowed to do something doesn't mean that we always should. Scope of practice is going to be your legal standing. When we talk standard of care, it's more like if an outside person or another EMT were to look at what you did, would somebody with the same training and the same abilities have done the same thing that you did? And that's kind of the litmus test for our standard of care. Did you rise to the occasion and do what it was that you should have done? And would somebody else have done the things that you did in the exact same way? So I mentioned duty to act a little bit. Duty to act is what I was just talking about as far as when are you legally obligated to provide your services as an EMT. When we talk about duty to act, we have a couple of little other bits and pieces that go into it. Duty to act is simple for us. There are other states where, just because you're an EMT, you are pretty much always on the clock. There are states here in the Northeast where if you can be identified as an EMT and you drive by an accident on the highway, you can be taken to task over that. So that's something to keep in mind when in your travels. I think it's Vermont, if memory serves correctly, that if you can be identified as someone who is certified to provide care and you drive by something on your off time, it can be a problem for you. What do you think duty to our patient involves?
I would think that involved just trying to do the right thing by the patient and, you know, making all your decisions on care based off what's best for the patient.
Perfect. Yeah, simply put, doing what's best for the patient, respecting their rights, serving as an advocate for them, and just honoring what it is that they want to do. We'll talk about refusal, and we'll talk about, advanced directives, things like the MOST form and DNR forms and stuff like that in just a little bit. But there are times where our duty to our patient may involve just doing what they want. And we have some pretty cut and dry directives on how we honor that and sort of what we're supposed to do. But first and foremost, and you guys will hear me say this a whole awful lot throughout the rest of the program, and when we get to the Massachusetts State Practical Exam, the first words out of your mouth in every single station, in every single scenario, are scene safety BSI. So your duty to self means that not only do you have to maintain your required credentials, maintain your skills, but we can't take care of other people unless we take care of ourselves. And our job when we step out of the back of an ambulance is to provide medical care. That's what our piece of this whole, emergency service is. So if we turn ourselves into a patient because we're not cognizant of the idea of making sure the scene is safe, making sure that we've got ourselves properly protected against things that are wet and sticky and not ours, we turn into a drawer on the scenario. We're a negative on the situation at that point. So duty to self, duty to partner, those are the first two main things we're going to look at every single time. Because running into, let's say for argument's sake, a hazmat situation, when you are not properly outfitted to deal with a hazardous material situation, you've just brought yourself into something that's unsafe. You've ignored your duty to self, you've ignored your duty to your partner, and you really aren't doing any better for the patient. On top of that, now you've created two more patients. And I think this is some of the part that a lot of times people in emergency services don't look at altogether awfully well, because we're mission focused people. We are, this is what I have to do, this is what I need to do, and this is what I'm going to do. And sometimes you miss the elephant in the room at that point. Duty to equipment, what I'll tell you is that sort of is a little bit further down on the list of things. Like, I've personally never broken anything on purpose or left anything behind on purpose. But when it comes to, does my patient need care and extrication and movement, or do I need to just get the hell out of here because something sideways is going on? Duty to self and duty to partner and duty to patient always come first. As far as making sure your equipment is always in working order and things like that, that is part of duty to patient, duty to self, duty to partner, because broken stuff gets people hurt. So all of these things kind of mesh themselves together in our duty to act and our standard of care. So talking about Good Samaritan laws, when you are off duty, you decide to assist somebody in the market basket having a cardiac event and unresponsive on the floor. What I will tell you is these Good Samaritan laws will protect you. Are intended to make sure that someone who is not currently being compensated for the service that they're providing, which would be CPR at that point if they're on the floor dead, as long as you're performing those acts in good faith and don't constitute anything that is gross negligence, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, you can't be found liable for any of the things that happen. If you're doing the things that you're supposed to and providing care up to your ability, which really, if you're not working out of the back of an ambulance, do you have any gear with you? I know I personally don't. I don't even have a pair of gloves in my car, strictly for that reason, because my duty to self is something that has been glaringly brought to my attention with recent events. I have a friend who stopped at an accident on the highway and traumatically had one of his legs removed from his person and almost the second one, and nearly died. So my idea of duty to act really is, making sure that I'm safe and I get to go home at the end of the day. As far as your Good Samaritan law, yes, if you do provide some sort of treatment in an emergency situation when you're off duty, you won't be found liable as long as you're not doing things that are crazy. Like, we're not talking about, ballpoint pen tracheotomies and things like that. If you are acting in good faith and doing things that you're supposed to do, like providing compressions to someone who's dead on the floor in Market Basket, it will all be okay for you. Now, you notice I didn't say you can't be sued, because people can file a lawsuit for anything that they want. That you can look at them sideways and you could be named as a defendant in a lawsuit. What the Good Samaritan law does is make it so that even if they decide to bring suit against you, the suit will not be successful. This all started in California in 1959, and the big take home, it is for unpaid services. So when you are at work, the Good Samaritan law doesn't protect you. The Good Samaritan law is only for time that is not compensated. And that bottom bullet point does not prevent you from being sued. We live in a very litigious and sue-happy time, so people can bring suit for just about anything. So there are some other little bits of protection here that we have. We have what's called sovereign immunity. This might be something that you guys will sort of be covered by. Sovereign immunity is also known as governmental immunity, and it prevents people being treated by government-operated EMS services from being sued for civil liability. Civil liability means, no, you won't go to jail, but somebody's going to have to write a check at the end of the day. It's kind of muddy waters with stuff like that. It's something that, yes, it's a protection under law, but it is not going to protect you from knowingly and wantonly doing the wrong thing. It's sort of a protection that means just because there was a negative outcome doesn't mean someone's going to be able to file suit and bankrupt the city of Everett. The statute of limitations for medical malpractice and negligence is 7 years. When we talk communications here in just a little bit, we'll talk report writing very, very briefly. And one of the things I can tell you about 7 years ago is I have no friggin' idea what I was doing 7 years ago, which is why communications and report writing and proper documentation of the things that you do on every single ambulance run that you will ever do between now and the end of your career is going to be your protection. I think we can make our peace with the fact that, yes, we live in a litigious society. People love to sue because people at the end of the day are a lot of times just looking for a payday. If you write a report that is incomplete and doesn't have all of the things that you did and didn't do and the reasons why and the assessments that you did and blah, da, 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 the beat goes on, it's going to be tough when 6 years and 364 days from the time that that incident occurred to get up on the stand and defend your actions or inactions just based on a poorly written report. And then contributory negligence. This is probably one of the biggest ones. In a couple of minutes, we'll talk about all the bits and pieces that go into finding of negligence. But this contributory negligence means that the patient, through their own actions, did something that contribute to the negligence claim against the EMS provider. So you're on scene talking to somebody and trying to convince them to go to the emergency room, and they don't want to go, they don't want to go, they don't want to go. They're on the sidewalk, and in order to get away from the encounter they're having with you, they step off the sidewalk and get run over by a bus. As long as you didn't push them in front of that bus, they contributed to the negligence that made them get run over by that bus. You won't be on the hook for that. It's kind of nice to be able to look at some stuff and go, all right, well, we won't have to eat it over this one. That's good, because there are plenty of times where you look back on patient care aspects of things, or, you know, patients that had negative outcomes, and you go, well, did I do all the things that I was supposed to? Is there anything I could have done better? And you start to pick apart your process, and it is difficult times at that point. So we have a couple of forms of medical direction. We have what is known as our standing orders. Those are going to be our protocols. That medication sheet that I pointed out to you all on Tavuti yesterday is going to be what your standing orders are. Those protocols are written and approved by all sorts of doctors with all sorts of credentials and post-nominals after their names, and they are the things that are deemed safe for us to do without having to speak to a soul, just based on our trainings and based on our level of education. That's our offline medical direction. Online medical direction is the other side to that coin. Online medical control is when you pick up the telephone or pick up the radio and get on the phone with a doctor or one of their designees at a resource hospital for them to give you direction on patient care that still is within your scope of practice. So I say still within your scope of practice because we couldn't pick up the radio and call medical control and ask for orders to do an appendectomy, you know, remove somebody's appendix surgically in their living room. What we would be calling medical control for are some of the gray areas that we operate in. You know, there's certain medications that we can give, but there's also certain times when we want to give those medicines that we have to pick up the phone and call the doc and run the whole case, run the whole scenario by them so that they can say either yay or nay, and we sort of live by whatever it is they tell us to do. Most of the time as a basic level EMT, we don't have to do a lot of medical control, medical direction telephone calls. But there are some times, and I will be good and well sure to point those out to you so that we all kind of know which page in the playbook we're playing from. Anybody have any questions with that? How's everybody doing so far? We holding our own?
Yeah, pretty good.
Good.
Yes, sir.
This is Eric Krause. I just have a quick question about the. I know you mentioned that when you have the when you're on an ambulance and anything you do, you document everything. Now, say that market basket situation that you were talking about. If you were just like off duty and something happens, would you still like document that? Would you document it yourself or talk to the ambulance once they arrive?
So I would talk to the providers once they got there. And really, once you're on the phone with 911, everything's recorded anyhow. A lot of times, if a perfect example, right? I was at Disney in the beginning of February, and I was standing there minding my own business, and I hear off to my right hand side, I hear, oh, someone say, oh my God, somebody get help. And I look, and there is this old lady just rumpled on the ground in the weirdest of weird positions. And I went, dead lady on the floor. So my wife's an EMT. Our youngest was with us. And he's like, the next thing I knew, I turned around and you two were gone. I got there and didn't necessarily immediately identify, because I would most of the time prefer to just be Joe bystander. I do, if like a patient requires more than just like helping them up, they tripped and fell and they need just a little assistance getting up, sooner rather than later, it's going to come out, yes, I'm an EMT, and that's when you're probably doing compressions in Market Basket. So yeah, you'd probably identify to the 911 operator, and as luck has it, everything on the 911 line is recorded. You'd give a bit of a report, and we'll talk about that a little bit too in communications to the crew when they show up. And you're still sort of only, when you provide care on your personal time, you're only functioning to the first responder level because you don't have all your equipment available to you. So you're not really providing care as an EMT. What you're really doing at that point is providing more basic first aid stuff, hands-only CPR, patient stabilization, making sure their airway is open, making sure they're breathing, things like that. You're not expected to be able to give epinephrine, nitroglycerin, aspirin, because, well, that's just not in my back pocket,
Right. Okay.
Did I answer your question, or did I walk all around it?
No, that answers it. Thank you.
Perfect. So now we're going to get into ethical and moral responsibilities. So ethics and morals are sort of the same thing, only inherently different. Ethics is just a bit of philosophy that is made to study morality and morals. So ethics is just sort of the study of morality as a whole. Morals in general are your concept of right and wrong. And as somebody who's going to be in the public eye, and as someone who from here on out is going to deal with the public a lot, we're not always measured by our own moral compass anymore. We are measured by the moral standard of right and wrong on a larger level. Because just because you thought something was right doesn't mean everyone is going to view it that way. And when placed under the microscope, we need to make sure that the things we are doing are moral and really do meet to the level of right versus wrong. There's a code of ethics for EMTs. You can Google it. It is readily available. The National Registry, I think, has it on their website. For the most part, what I will tell you is fire service, EMS, police officers, nobody gets into the field of public safety. And it's sort of like I said yesterday, nobody gets into this thinking, boy, I can't wait to be a jerk for the next 35 years. That's kind of not the way most of us are cut. And most of the people that is their MO, they don't make it. So we don't normally run afoul of ethics and morals as providers, just because we either weed ourselves out or we get weeded out by default. And most of the people that are in this field because their interest is doing the greater good, actually helping people, really sort of going that extra step to make sure that the duty to patient is right on the heels of duty to self and duty to partner. It is right there as something we are making one of our main priorities, one of our main objectives. So just by signing your name on the dotted line and really lining up with Everett Fire and taking this class, ethics and morals isn't really something we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about, because, geez, you guys have already been well vetted for that. My job's easy. All I got to do is teach you this stuff. So now we're going to talk about patient consent. Patient consent is one of the biggest things that we have to think about all the time, because we are really, for the most part, not allowed to treat people without their own consent. Most patients are able to provide and withdraw consent for treatment, transport, assessment at pretty much any time. There are some times we're going to talk about where consent is involuntary, but we'll talk about all of the normal things first. Informed consent, simply put, means you had a discussion with your patient. You talked to them about the associated risks and consequences of the treatment that you're looking to provide, and then they moved on and expressed that consent. So normally, somebody picks up the phone, calls 911, you guys will show up, you'll start doing your assessment of your patient, you'll get to talking to your patient about what you think is going on and what you think needs to happen. And in that discussion, you are going through them with, you know, what it is the issue is, what could happen if they don't go and get treatment, and what you need to do as a provider to actually treat that on the way to the emergency room. And they're going to express consent to you. Yep, I think that's a great idea. Expressed consent is obtained from every single conscious, mentally competent adult before we begin patient care. And it doesn't have to be this big, long, drawn-out thing. Most of the time, just the patient being involved in the assessment and not sort of giving us the brush off is our expressed consent. Implied consent is what's going to give us the right to treat this guy right here who is unresponsive on the sidewalk. Implied consent, we go back to our measuring stick of what is reasonable. What would a rational human being want us to do? Now, I'm sure this guy doesn't want us to leave him unresponsive on the side of the road. So we measure it against what rational people would want and say, if he was awake, we would be able to have this informed, expressed consent relationship with him. But since he's unresponsive and a normal person would want us to fix that, implied consent is what gives us the right to treat this patient without actually speaking to him. Our consent to treat a minor, that is obtained from a parent, legal guardian, someone who has been granted rights to do those kinds of decisions, like the school that the kid goes to. Generally, we try to obtain that before we put hands on a minor patient, but that's not always possible. We can get dispatched to anywhere. I taught a class for Peabody Fire just a little while ago, and some of the guys who were in my EMT class for that actually had a cardiac arrest save of a 15-year-old who went into cardiac arrest on a basketball court in the middle of a playground. Not a parent to be found, because kids were just out playing pickup basketball like kids do. And we fall right back to the implied consent. A reasonable, rational person would want us to address and treat the things that we can in order to fix this problem, and we can worry about the informed and expressed consent piece of it afterwards. If there's no guardian or there's no parent available, we are still able to treat minor patients under implied consent. And then we last but not least have involuntary consent. Here in Massachusetts, we have what is known as a Section 12. Section 12 used to be called a pink slip. The only people in the state of Massachusetts that can fill this out are police officers or qualified medical personnel. So doctors, nurse practitioners, and PAs. We are as EMTs and you guys as firefighters are not able to fill out a Section 12 and have somebody involuntarily held against their will. It can be if we are dealing with someone who's mentally incompetent and deemed a significant risk of harm to themselves or others. That is Section 12 pretty much to the letter of the law. If it has been deemed that someone is of great risk of harm to self or pretty much harm to community or others, they will be committed for a period of up to 72 hours and held against their will. That same document will allow us to actually transport people, say, from an emergency room to a psychiatric hospital for involuntary commitment. Law enforcement can do it for people who are in police custody. Just because they're in custody and don't want to go to the emergency room doesn't mean you just let them die in a jail cell. Law enforcement can make that involuntary consent decision and send somebody to the emergency room. So these all making sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Beauty. So our duty to act tells us that when we show up to a call, it is our job to take care of our patient. But there are plenty of times where that is not what the patient wants. Thankfully for us, this is not a game time decision. When we talk about do not resuscitate orders, living wills, durable power of attorney, or this bottom one where it says physician order for life-sustaining treatment, as you'll come to see, Massachusetts has to be different, and I'll explain in just a minute when I get to the picture of what I'm talking about here on the next slide. But do not resuscitate order is a legal document. It is very, very old, and we don't see many of these anymore. Do not resuscitate orders were a piece of paper that told us if they were filled out appropriately, signed by the patient and their doctor, and everything, all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed, that if this patient was found in cardiac arrest, we were not to touch them. And it wasn't a violation of our standard of care. It wasn't a violation of protocol because this was the patient's wishes. It was made by a competent, sound adult and their medical care provider. And if they were in cardiac arrest, we were not to resuscitate. The physician order for life-sustaining treatment is the new version of that. In Massachusetts, we have a MOLST form. Instead of a POST form, it is not the physician order for life-sustaining treatment here in the Commonwealth. It is the Massachusetts order for life-sustaining treatment. So the MOLST form or the POST form allows the patient some autonomy to choose what kind of care and treatment they actually wish to have performed on them. So if your patient doesn't want to be intubated and placed on a ventilator or have a feeding tube put in or provided with some form of invasive ventilatory support, they can actually check that box on this form right here, and it will tell us what we are allowed to do, what we aren't allowed to do. So looking at this form quickly, because most of the things that we do happen in pretty short order, right? Everything is pretty fast, pretty rapid in the field of emergency service. All the things on the left are do not. All the things on the right are do. So if you have boxes on the left checked, you need to take a quick look at this and pay closer attention to it, because there could be some things on there that you aren't supposed to do. If the boxes on the right are checked, that means it's game time and do the things that you know that you're supposed to as far as treatment goes. Well, what we need to do is make sure that these forms, when we see them, are all valid and completely filled out and signed appropriately, because once we decide not to resuscitate someone, that's like a no takes backsies, right? Once we decide, all right, this is what they wanted, so we're not gonna start working this cardiac arrest, they're, once they're dead forever. So if there's ever any question whether this form is accurate, whether this form is valid, we need to err on the side of caution and actually provide care and treatment. If this form can't be produced, if they say, oh no, they're a do not resuscitate, they have a most form, they don't want, to be worked as a cardiac arrest, but then no one can hand you this piece of paper, we have to work the cardiac arrest. It's generally not a great thing when that kind of stuff happens. And most people that have these forms, the one sort of bonus that we run into is they know they're sort of getting to the end of their string. They know life is sort of on the downslope, and they make sure, and their families make sure, that this paperwork is easily accessible in the event that something happens. So most of the time, yes, do families call 911 when their loved one goes into cardiac arrest? They sure do. But most of the time you are greeted with this piece of paper, and it's probably one of the first thing you lay eyes on. People call 911 because they're scared and they don't know what else to do. But once they present you with this form, your job switches a little bit from patient care to family care, because if they have all these do not resuscitate, do not ventilate, do not do this, do not do that, do not transfer to the hospital, then our care for the patient who's in cardiac arrest is sort of non-existent. The family called because the family needs some care at that point, and our focus and our gears change a little bit.
I do have a quick question.
Shoot.
In the book, there was a question of ethics about if the family or if the patient has this form completely signed out and the family is asking you to help. What do you do in that scenario?
So you're right. It is an ethical type of conundrum to wind up in, isn't it? That's why it's always good that not only do we work in partnerships, we also show up with, lots of people. So most of the time an ambulance goes out or an engine goes out, it comes with at least one cruiser and one of the other, right? So there could be 6, 7, 8 people on scene, and it gives an EMT or the team of EMTs the ability to kind of peel off and go sort of deal with what's going on with the patient, and then other folks to talk to the family.
Okay.
You'll see those kind of things happen a lot too with people who go home on hospice. I was in my mother's living room, I was my father's hospice care provider, and I've seen sick people plenty of times. And I've been on the receiving end of those phone calls for people who had a family member home on hospice, and they called and they're just like, we cannot do this anymore. We need somebody to come. We need to transfer mom, dad, my maiden aunt Sally, whoever, to the emergency room, to the hospice center, to wherever, because this has gotten real now, because it's not a pretty thing to watch. So it happens a lot where you'll show up and somebody will have, do not transfer to the hospital or do not resuscitate. And you get there and from being able to draw from things that and from experience that, you kind of got called because the end is near and the family's having a tough time. It's not really my job to talk them out of it, but I might talk to them about it so that maybe, because that person was home on hospice because their wish was to die in their own house. And we kind of play a little bit like armchair psychologist at that point as well. And decisions get made. There's not really going to be a right or a wrong, because if the family, you can't talk to the patient if they're in cardiac arrest, right? So if the family is adamant that you do something for this patient that's in cardiac arrest, I can't verify whether their last dying words were, please do something, save me. And if the family's saying, no, 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 they took it back, they want to be saved. All right, well, I'll work the cardiac arrest. And what I can tell you is, more likely than not, when we get to the CHA in Everett, and we're working that cardiac arrest as we go walking through the door, and I hand the most form to the doctor, and I tell them why we are working this cardiac arrest and what's going on, all measures will stop. So,
Okay.
personally, did I really get to honor that patient's wishes? Not necessarily, but I did what was the greater good for everyone. So really, maybe it wasn't the most ethical of decisions, but my moral compass lets me be okay with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
I've got a quick question.
All right, I'll try it.
Now, this could be a huge what if, but let's say one of us got to a call and one of these forms were produced, and we follow it to the T, whatever way it may be. But let's say it's falsified. Is there a chance that one of these could be falsified and we wouldn't know? And then after the fact, could we be held liable for it?
So liable, no. If you were handed the form and it was appropriately filled out, and to the best of your knowledge, you were following what was on the piece of paper, you'd never be the one who got it over that, because really at that point, more likely than not, the person who falsified it is probably the one who handed it to you. So they're going to go to jail, not sue.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you don't wind up having to wear it over that. You can only go with what you see, right? And if they hand you this form and it's filled out, the patient signed it, the doctor signed it, or the patient's, the patient's designee, somebody who's been assigned the ability to make decisions for them, has signed it. I mean, the doctor's name's on there, the telephone number's on there. The best you can do is what this piece of paper is telling you to do, because these are things that were all supposed to have been laid out ahead of time.
Okay.
Has it probably happened? Sure. I'm sure it probably has. But no, there's really no way that we can figure out whether it was disingenuously done and it's a fraud. So all we can go is with what the piece of paper that we've been handed says, and that's what we base our clinical decisions on.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, I am, before we get into competency, gonna put you guys on a 5-minute break so we can let this cool off for a minute, and we'll come back. If there's any questions, I'll answer them. And then from there, we will trudge right along through the rest of medical, legal, and ethical.
Hello? Worked.
Hey, my name is Shane.
Stop.
All right, folks, we're back. And we talked about consent. So now we're going to talk about competency. Because people can't just consent to treatment unless they're competent. People also can't refuse treatment unless they are deemed competent. Most of the time, it's very, very easy to figure out, is this patient mentally all there and able to make an informed and appropriate decision for themselves? Sometimes it's a bit more difficult, but what we need to be able to do is have a reasonable conversation with people to make sure that we can ensure that they are competent. Patients must be lucid and capable of making an informed decision. Every single patient we encounter, we're going to perform a mental status check on. If a patient is alert and able to speak to me and can tell me that they are oriented by telling me who they are, where they are, and what's going on, I know that this patient, whether I agree with their decision or not, is for the most part going to be able to refuse care. I can't just go running off and kidnap people. The minute somebody tells you that they don't want treatment, they don't want transport, they don't even want you in their space, we kind of don't have a whole lot of recourse on top of that. unless we can answer yes to some of these other questions, like, do they have an altered level of consciousness? You know, okay, fine, they can tell me who they are, they can tell me where they are, they can tell me what time it is and what's going on. But do I have to shake them awake in order to get those questions even out to them? So if they have an altered level of consciousness, it chips away at their competency, and it makes it more difficult for us to, in good faith, accept a refusal from these people. Some of the other ones are, you know, a bit more black and white. Do they have a head injury? Are they under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Those kinds of things are absolute no-goes. Yes, this patient may be able to answer my questions and talk to me like a normal human, but if they are just loaded on whatever it is their favorite recreational pharmaceutical happens to be, I can't say that they are competent, which means I can't actually inform them of this next bit on our patient refusal checklist. And this is something that gets done for real on any refusal we take. What I'll tell you as far as refusals go is it is so much easier to just pick somebody up and take them to the emergency room and drop them off and write that report than it is to document all of the things that you need to add to a patient refusal in order to make sure that you're protected. I will browbeat, I will bargain, I'll damn near threaten in order to get somebody to go to the emergency room. Because at the end of the day, somebody thought this was important enough to pick up the phone and call 911. Someone thought this patient was sick enough that they needed help and they needed to be evaluated. So I don't like being the person who, you know, they used to say solicits a refusal and tries to convince a patient that they don't need to go to the emergency room. I would so much prefer to just bring you to the emergency room. Conscious, alert, altered, under the influence, it never mattered to me. I really much preferred to just pick you up at point A, bring you to point B, drop you off and say, have a nice day. Because I knew at the end of the day, I didn't have to worry about doing any of this. Because if we didn't get a whole story or didn't necessarily get all the wheres and what fors when we were talking to the patient, because, well, people don't always tell the truth, it sort of leaves us in limbo a little bit, and it leaves us having to sort of be hanging in the breeze unless we can document. Now, do anything and everything you can to try and persuade someone to go to the emergency room. We have to ensure that they're competent, so they have to be conscious, alert, and oriented. They have to have no signs or symptoms of a head injury. They can't be under the influence of drugs and alcohol. That is how we verify competency. But even still, some people just don't want to go to the emergency room. In all my years, a number of times, I've had the legitimate conversation with people that was like, hey, listen, if you don't at least just let us transport you, I don't care, you don't want me to touch you, you don't want to answer any of my questions, you don't want me to check your vital signs, that's fine. But if you don't at least let me bring you to the emergency room, you could wake up dead in the morning, like you won't be down for breakfast. So, you know, we have to have a little bit of give and take here. Once we've determined that the patient is competent, they can make any decision that they want, and good, bad, or ugly, whether you agree with it or you don't, we're guilty of at least assault and battery and probably kidnapping if we force them to do these things against their will. Like I said, I will beg, I will borrow, I will steal, I will browbeat, I will tell them, like, listen, you're probably gonna die. This is what I think is going on. So I clue them in a little bit on my assessment and try and talk to them about what could happen if I'm right with what's going on with them. I've enlisted the help of medical control before, and I've picked up the telephone and told the doctor what I was dealing with. And a lot of times, if you put that patient on scene on the phone with an MD, and the doctor says, hey, listen, those guys are right. You'll probably be dead before morning if you don't come to the emergency room and get evaluated. A lot of times we wind up not taking a refusal in that situation. People just want to hear it from, you know, somebody whose opinion maybe they value a little bit more than some guy that they just met who hopped out of an ambulance. I get that. Personally speaking, give me a good medic or a good EMT any day over a doctor, because at least I know my best interest is going to be cared for. Encourage the patient to seek help later. Some of the things we need to include in our interaction with a patient who wants to sign a refusal is, you know, just because you're refusing care now doesn't mean you can't change your mind. If you decide 5 minutes from now, 5 hours from now, that you want to go to the emergency room and be evaluated, pick up the phone, call 911. Someone who looks just like me will be right back here standing in your living room, and we will be on our way to the emergency room. No questions asked, you know, no harm, no foul. And hopefully you'll still be in good enough shape that the emergency room will be able to help you. So I loop in the whole, like, hey, this could be personally expensive to you. This could be something that if we don't go get you care for right now, it might be too late when you call in 5 minutes or 5 hours. You know, you could be in such poor condition at that point that, you know, maybe there's not much we can do for you other than keep you comfortable and let people come in and say goodbye. Enlist the help of family members, enlist the help of friends, have their neighbor, whoever. It doesn't just get to the point where it's like, okay, you want to sign a refusal? I'll see you next week. Like, we can't do that, because we do need to be concerned for the greater good, but we also need to be concerned for what happens downstream if something negative happens to this person that we just left in their living room. And at the end of the day, like I was talking about earlier, the thing that's going to save you is a well-written report that documents all of the steps that you took in order to make sure that nothing terrible was going to happen to this patient. So if it doesn't go in your report, it didn't actually happen. So document everything. Patients actually, when we fill out the refusal form, they actually have to sign it. So that'll help us a little bit too. Sometimes, especially if the patients are particularly worked up, they'll refuse to sign it. That doesn't mean we're sunk. There's spots on those refusal forms for us to have a witness sign. Since you guys are going to be working for Everett Fire, your best bet when we talk about having a witness sign a refusal is probably going to be Everett PD, not another Everett firefighter, because it's an objective third party. It's somebody it can't be your partner. You know, it's somebody who's not really technically involved with that situation of patient care, who's saying, yes, I watched this EMT struggle, fuss, and fight for 45 minutes trying to convince this guy to go to the emergency room. And at every turn, it was no, 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 no. And then he refused to sign the form. I am putting my John Hancock down, saying that these guys did whatever they could to make this patient go to the emergency room. Patient refusals are a real pain in the neck, in case you didn't get that just yet.
Hey, Tommy, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
So when it comes to in the last slide, it said medical direction. That's the same as medical control, right?
Yep.
And then so that being said, like if you were to call into medical control, is it the patient that's communicating with them, or are you kind of like asking them for help and then relaying that message to the patient?
So both, really. If you're looking for actual direction on patient care, you'll be the one speaking with the doc. You know, if you have, you'll have at that point done your assessment, gotten some vital signs, started to develop a treatment plan, and gotten to a point where we need to call the doc to make sure that this is what's going on and this is what's going to be best case scenario. There are some stuff in our protocols where we do have to make that phone call for sure. There's also times where you're just going to run out of rope and need the lifeline on the other end to say, yeah, this is right. Just occupy transport and get them to the emergency room. We'll take care of the rest. Cool. I can do that. In a situation where we're talking refusal, I will call medical control, explain to them the situation, and then hand my telephone to the patient or put the doc on speaker so that they can talk to each other directly. I don't need to be the middleman for that, because the doc can give his honest opinion to the patient and say, yeah, you should go to the emergency room, or you know what, maybe, all right, well, fine. You don't want to go, we'll leave you in your apartment, but just know that you could be dead.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yep. So the next we'll talk about is negligence. We talked about negligence a little bit. I mentioned it in pretty much name alone. There are a whole host of things that need to happen in order for you to be found negligent. First, we'll talk about the different actions that can be taken. So we could be found criminally liable. It's not very normal that, you know, in the commission of your duties as an EMT, you are found in criminal violation of the law and wind up going to jail. But this would be if the state or the government were to bring some form of charge against you, and it could lead to fine or incarceration. More often than not, civil action is what is taken against EMTs and EMS systems and ambulance companies or services. Civil action means a person, any person, brings a lawsuit against you, the agency, the department itself, and anyone else who is directly or indirectly involved in patient care, and name you as the defendant in a lawsuit. Civil action is accusing you of committing a tort. A tort is what is a wrongful act that resulted in injury or damage. More often than not, what winds up happening with this is the plaintiff, the person bringing the lawsuit, is seeking compensation for the damages. And they are saying that the damages were a result of your actions or inactions, and it goes through the court proceedings, and you're either found civilly liable or not. Thankfully, for the most part, these will get settled out of court, and it's very infrequent that the actual EMT themselves is the one who winds up writing the check. They name all sorts of people in these suits, and generally the people with the deepest pockets and the best insurance are the ones that wind up writing a check. If, as a provider, you are found civilly liable in one of these civil cases of a tort, it's just one of those things that is sort of tough on a career. So what we need to make sure is that we dot our I's and cross our T's. It's why it is so infinitely important that you stay up to speed on your skills. You do the things that you know that you're supposed to. You don't do things that you know that you're not. There's cases all the time of, you know, one that always jumps out to me is, I think it was New Jersey. There was a motor vehicle collision. The woman who was driving one of the cars, I believe, was pregnant, and she was killed next to instantly. But she was almost ready to deliver. So the medics on scene picked up the phone, called medical control, looking for some medical direction. And medical direction ordered them to do something that was outside of their scope of practice. And they did it. And they were both civilly liable and fired for doing something that was so far outside of their scope of practice, outside of the realm of things that were acceptable for them to do, that they wound up on the hook for it. So making sure that we do the things that we're supposed to appropriately, and we stay up to speed on our skills and stay up to speed on changes in protocols and changes in medicine and different things that come down the pipe is going to be important. You know, just leaning back and saying, well, that's not the way we've always done it, is a recipe for you to do something bad without even knowing that you did something bad. EMS and being an EMT is something that requires lifelong education. That's why every 2 years you're going to have to recertify. You have to take classes. You have to stay on top of protocols and any changes that come along, because it is part of your patient care. In order to prove negligence, these are the things that has to be proved against you. So they have to be able to prove that you had a duty to act. So you had to have been at work, signed on, ready to go. You breached that duty. So for one reason or another, you had a duty to act and you decided not to. You didn't do what you were supposed to, knowingly or otherwise. The third piece is the patient suffered some form of injury or harm. So it has to be something that is recognized as compensable injury from your actions or inactions. And then last but not least, that the injuries were a result of that breach. So it can't be, you know, the patient didn't suffer any harm because of what you did or didn't do. If it wasn't a direct result of all four of these things, so you had a duty to act, you breached that duty to act, the patient suffered an injury, and the injuries were because you breached your duty, then negligence is at hand. If you didn't have a duty to act, you can't be negligent. So you can't be found negligent of seeing somebody on the ground in aisle 2 at Market Basket and deciding, since you didn't have your gloves and you didn't have a BVM and you didn't have an AED, that you decided to just walk on by. You know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with, you know, your personal time being your personal time, and not stopping at every fender bender and not stopping every time somebody says, is there a doctor on the plane? Because there are times where putting yourself in that situation maybe isn't following duty to self. Because I can tell you, I hate flying. If anybody ever said, is there a doctor or is there an EMT? Is there somebody on the plane with any medical knowledge? I'm keeping my happy behind in my seat, because I don't even like getting up to go to the bathroom. So I can assure you, I would be all thumbs and next to useless in a patient care role.
I have a quick question.
All right, let's hear it.
Going back to your story about out of New Jersey, in a situation like that where medical control clearly is either mistaken on your scope when they request you to do something that's out of your scope, I assume you have the right to say, hey, that's out of my scope, I'm not doing that.
So short answer is yes. Longer answer is there's probably better delivery. So remind them that you are a BLS ambulance. So, you know, Doc, I'm not sure you heard me correctly. This is Everett Fire BLS 1. And they'll think back probably on what it was that they just asked you to do and go, oh, holy crap, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the BLS part. And they'll change their order. Or the other piece is you repeat the order back to them. You know, Doc, this is Everett Fire BLS 1. Just want to confirm the order was to perform an emergency C-section on the side of the road. And the doc will go, oh, wait a minute, that's stupid. And if that still doesn't work, you know, it's a bit deeper of a conversation at that point, because that's what they did. They performed an emergency cesarean section and everyone died. They lost their tickets, they lost their livelihood, and it was all because a medical control doctor said, do this, and they went, okay. Because what I can tell you is I've seen a lot of EMT textbooks, I've seen a lot of paramedic textbooks, and I've seen a lot of everything in between. And never, not anywhere, one time have I ever seen the training or steps on how to perform a C-section at an accident scene, because it's not something that as emergency providers we do. My response to that doctor, if I couldn't sort of bargain my way out of that whole fight, would have probably been, all right, listen, doc, if you want that to happen, you better hop in your car, because I know that that's outside of the greater realm of scope of practice. Like, I know that is nowhere in any national curriculum for EMTs, paramedics, or anyone. So I know that I shouldn't be doing that, and I know that that is not an order that lawfully I am obligated to follow. Now, I would try to err on not starting a huge fight with the medical control doctor at that point, but if I had to, all right, I'm built for that fight. We can do it.
Thank you.
So negligence comes in a couple of flavors. Negligence at its
I'm
most.
sorry, sir. I have a question. In that situation, you know, when you call medical director, would you also be able to, you know, when you repeat back the orders, tell them that you're not equipped to do that and to send like an AEMT or a paramedic while conducting the vital signs and giving them oxygen and try to keep them comfortable? Is that something that you would follow procedures in doing?
Yeah, so for the most part, and when we talk about patient assessment, one of the things you'll see is that things in the classroom happen a bit different than things in the street do. But when we start assessing our patient, there are certain things that will trigger me to say, you know what, I need a paramedic right now.
Mhm.
And we will call and ask for a paramedic right there from the scene the minute we decide that we need one. And they either catch up to us or we bring them to the emergency room where, you know, advanced level providers live anyway. So there are some things like respiratory patients, altered mental status patients, cardiac patients. You know, those are times where you'll look at the patient and go, oh man, this patient looks just dreadful. And you won't even really have spoken to them. You'll have no idea what is actually going on with them yet at the moment. But just being able to, and when we talk about shock and some of the other negative things that'll start like just jumping up and waving to us just by looking at a patient, you'll be able to go like, oh, not only do we need a paramedic, we need to be in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll request that paramedic, you'll start working towards occupy and transport quicker, especially out in the street working on real people. And then great, if the paramedic catches me, that's awesome. But what's, generally speaking, how big is the city of Everett?
Decent size. I mean, it's big. Not that big
Like
for like
4, 5, 6 miles across? Something?
3
Yeah.
square miles.
How many?
I believe it's 3.
Okay, so you're never really more than 3 miles away from an emergency room, right? So the best case scenario when you look at someone, especially as a BLS provider who's really, really sick looking, is, okay, it's time to leave now. And we get them out to the ambulance and we get transporting. We do a lot of the things that we can do as BLS providers on the way. And sure, if a paramedic catches up to us, that's fantastic because they can do all the fancy stuff in the back of the ambulance. But if they don't catch up to us, it's not like all is lost or we did anything negative for our patient, because at the end of the day, my goal is to get this patient to the emergency room in as good of fashion as I can, so as least sick as could be. Who was that? Alex, right? Did I answer you?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
No problem. So we'll talk about negligence here. Negligence just really means that you deviated from the standard of care, but you deviated from the standard of care for no real reason. So simple negligence just means you made a mistake. What I'll tell you, knowing plenty of people in this industry, is we can make mistakes. We can make huge mistakes. You will see the deeper you get into your career as emergency providers, right? You will know people that have made mistakes and accidentally killed people. It's not something that they set out to do. Maybe they've miscalculated a medic who miscalculated a medication or accidentally gave the wrong medication. Looked at an EKG and missed somebody having a pretty significant cardiac event and they wind up dying. That kind of stuff happens. We are people, we are not machines. So simple negligence, a mistake was made. What I can tell you is the National Registry and Massachusetts OEMS don't just come riding down from on high and tear people's certifications up and, cost them their livelihood. If you make a mistake, mistakes are expected. It's how you respond to that mistake, which will sort of dictate how much trouble you wind up in for a simple negligence. If you just, perform your mea culpa and say, "Yep, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. What can I do to fix this and make sure that it doesn't happen again?" You wind up normally with some remediation, probably an education plan, something like that. But life goes on. It's a bump in the road. People understand that mistakes get made. The people who don't do as well when they're being investigated for a mistake are the ones who maybe falsify a document or lie when they're being investigated and say, or want to defend their action like it was correct and want to argue, fuss, and fight about why what they did was right. Well, it's right here in black and white. We're showing you why what you did was wrong. So either say, yes, I was wrong and learn from it, or continue to defend your wrong action, and we will help you learn from it. Simple negligence is a thing. It happens. It's not a big deal. That's why ambulance calls and quality assurance and things like that exist, because we need to continually improve. The better you are, the better your patients do. It's not a huge deal. And I think everybody, especially in the beginning, everybody is always like, well, what happens if I do something wrong? Learn from it and be better next time. It's really not, that's the long and short of it. Now, gross negligence is a horse of a different feather. Gross negligence means willfully and wantonly you did something reckless. You did something that you knew to be wrong, and in knowingly doing that, you intentionally caused harm. So simple negligence, just a mistake. Gross negligence, what you did was on purpose and you knew that it wasn't right. There's a way big difference between the two of those, and it's as clear as night and day. If you make a mistake, chalk it up, learn from it, move on. Gross negligence is never acceptable. You did something that you knew was reckless and going to cause damage, and just absolutely threw all caution to the wind for patient care. And that's dangerous and really just not acceptable. All right. Moving on to one of the last couple things we have to hit here in medical, legal, and ethical. We're going to talk about patient abandonment. The book definition of patient abandonment is stopping treatment without giving it to somebody else. Now, as an EMT, you have to transfer your patient's care to someone of an equal or higher level of training. So we'll go back to what you asked, Alex, about a paramedic. As an EMT, when a paramedic arrives on scene, I will transfer my patient care to that paramedic. And the paramedic is the one who is now responsible for taking care of that patient. If I let the paramedic unit transport and clear and go do something else, I didn't abandon that patient because I gave them to someone with a report who was a higher level of care for that patient. The same rings true for when we get to the emergency room. When you get to the emergency room, it is part of our duty to actually wait with the patient until a nurse comes to accept this patient as theirs. So until somebody comes and takes over and hears your story about what it was going on with this patient and what you did for this patient, you are still Johnny on the spot. You are still the person who is responsible for this patient until someone of a higher level of training comes. You have a face-to-face interaction with them. You speak to them and hand over this patient's care.
Question, sir.
Yeah.
After that takes happened, would we be having to have them sign off on the paperwork confirming that they had received it just for documents and protection against lawsuits?
So I am not 100% what your documentation is going to look like.
Right.
Some of them will require a signature from the receiving facility, which would be the emergency room wherever you drop them off.
Correct.
If they don't, it's always a good idea to just get the first name, last initial, and put it in the narrative of your run sheet.
Okay.
So that way you have evidence of, hey, listen, I gave report to, nurse.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it was like a clear, like, handing off the patient, to somebody with higher authority, so there'd be no confusion of like saying I abandoned the person.
Yeah, it's not typically a very big deal in the emergency room because normally we call them either on the radio or on the telephone to let them know that we're coming in with a patient.
Mhm.
And generally somebody is in short order waiting for us to get there and hand over the patient. It gets a little trickier. Like if you look at the picture right here, this looks like a doctor that this EMT is getting ready to give report to. Doctors and nurses have two different jobs in the emergency room. They're both patient care, but they are complete and total ships passing in the night. If you show up, and I assume you guys are probably going to be transporting to the Everett more often than not. If you show up at the Everett and a doctor is waiting to take report, make sure you talk to that patient's nurse too. Because doctors get busy, they go off and do doctor things, and the communication doesn't always go both ways. So not that you'd be guilty of abandoning the patient, I'm just thinking best practice here is the nurse is going to be the one who's more concretely, directly responsible for what happens to this patient. The doctor's going to see them, evaluate them, and send orders. The nurse is the one who's actually doing a lot of the work. So make sure you have an encounter with the patient's nurse just to kind of give them the wheres and what fors, and things will go a lot easier and a lot smoother for your patient. I'm not saying don't give report to the doc, but just try and talk to both at that point. I've only ever once in my life given report to a doctor, like only a doctor. And that was because the doc met us in the room. It was busy in the ER. He was a young guy, and he was doctor and nurse at that point because he was starting IVs and doing all sorts of wild stuff that doctors don't normally do.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like a crazy scenario, because I know there's days in the ER they'll probably be, not as busy, and then it's probably, chaos nights, and it's just
Oh,
like
sure. Yeah.
just trying to picture one of those scenarios, like everyone's running around, you got multiple, people in there with from massive injuries, from traumas to just simple, superficial, maybe a sunburn. So if people are just running around, I'm just trying to figure out the best idea of like who's on hand to have them at least sign off and say, I didn't abandon this person.
Yeah, and really just make sure if your documentation doesn't have a spot for a signature from the receiving facility, just first name, last initial is plenty to put in your I always. I got an injury in 2012 and haven't really worked many road shifts since then, you know, guest spots here and there. But I've never actually filled out a patient care report on a computer. We were still doing them by hand at the place I worked at previously. And I would always get first name, last initial of the nurse that I gave report to, just to make sure that even though I knew she didn't have to sign, I at least had, hey, this is the person. Like, do you have a Jessica F that works as an RN in the emergency room? Oh yeah, we do. She was actually that patient's nurse. Yeah, no kidding, because that's who I gave report to. Now go call and complain on somebody else.
Heard. Thank you, sir.
So this is it. This is the last little bit of our medical, legal, and ethical. We are going to be responsible for protecting our patients' privacy. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It is really simply for us, we're going to get a lot of sensitive information about people. We may get names, dates of births, insurance card numbers, social security numbers. We'll find out about different medical problems that people may have that they might not want everyone to know about. And it is our job to protect that. Pretty simple. As EMTs, we don't discuss any aspects of patient care with anyone who wasn't directly involved with patient care. We don't just hand out information, don't lose paperwork. When you finish working on the computer or whatever it is that you're going to do your reporting on, close out the program, lock the workstation so that not everyone in the world can just sit down and read about, you know, whatever was going on with your HIV positive patient, or, you know, your patient who has whatever medical malady in the world wrong with them. Just do the right thing, really, is what HIPAA tells me. I don't discuss anything about anything when it has to do with patient care or any protected healthcare information. PHI is the big thing. Anything that we learn about a patient in the commission of our duties as caregivers, as patient care people, is protected healthcare information, and it is on us to protect that and not give it to anyone. There is always, you know, news cameras and stuff around, everybody looking to take videos and stick microphones in your face. Just don't talk to them. Keep walking right on by. I'm sure every fire has a public information officer and someone whose job it is to vet information and give information when the time is right. It's not on us to decide when the time is right. Just say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to discuss that with you, and get in your ambulance and be on your way. That's really the soup to nuts what we need to think about with HIPAA. It is not a violation of HIPAA for you to give report to a nurse or another EMT or another paramedic who's going to be responsible for this patient's care. It is not a violation of HIPAA for someone to tell you things about this patient. It is just something that you need to understand, that we are going to get a lot of sensitive material and a lot of big time information about our patients. And we need to protect that because it is private information. All right, guys, that was your first lecture. What'd you think?
Tommy,
Good, Tom.
a question about patient abandonment, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all. What's up?
Say if you arrive on scene of a, say, car accident or something, and you go right up to the first person that you notice, and they don't have any like life-threatening injuries. Then you notice somebody, say, with like an amputated arm, and you leave that patient because
they don't have any life-threatening injuries to go to that guy with the missing arm. Would that be considered patient abandonment because you left one person for somebody with the more life-threatening?
No, when we look at stuff like that, right? When we triage patients, we're always trying to do the most good for the most amount of people. And once we have more patients than we can care for, we need additional resources anyway at that point. If you show up and the first patient you see has, nothing bronchitis, there's not so much as a bump, a bruise, or a scrape on them, and someone else in the vehicle with them is actively bleeding to death in front of you, you have just triaged those people. All right, there's nothing wrong with this guy, and this guy will die while we futz around with the person who's well. So no, you haven't abandoned them. We're going to talk scene size up and stuff probably the end of the week, I think. And some of that sort of gets taken care of when we start talking about need for additional resources. You only have the ability to take care of one critically ill patient. And if you show up and you have one critically ill patient and a second person who needs to be evaluated, you go to the critically ill patient and you call for more help. Because people that are really, really sick, really, really injured will definitely keep you hopping and busy enough without having to mess around with, someone who's not really altogether that sick. Triage doesn't constitute abandonment. All right, so we're going to take another break. This one will be a couple minutes longer. We'll probably go 10, 15 just to make sure everything sinks in a little bit. What do you guys think? Was that too fast, too slow, just right?
No, I think that was just right.
Okay.
Yeah, for me that was.
I just like to make sure, especially in the beginning, I like to make sure I'm not blowing anybody's doors off. So if that was good, then I'm a happy camper.
Real quick before we go, just like maybe 60 seconds ago, I can't see the slides anymore. I don't know if anybody else is having that issue.
No, I stopped them.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Never mind.
Yeah, no, I did that. All right, so we'll stop the recording. So let's get into it. Chapter 4, communications. Here you'll see the actual dispatch communications room here at Cataldo. It has gotten a bit more crowded and a bit more technological as time drudges along. This is probably a really old picture. I know, did one of you all come from the communications side? Is one of you guys a dispatcher or something?
He's already got EMT. He's
already got an EMT. Oh, it means he's here today. Actually, I'm looking to talk to somebody about that because my dispatch certification is going to expire soon, and God help me if I have to sit through that class again. So anyhow, radios work by wave. We have base stations, which is your typical antenna. Your base station is generally really high powered, puts out about 80 to 150 watts. The antenna will be close by to the base station so that that signal that they are transmitting can be picked out and sent pretty much over a wide range. Without some of the other bits and pieces that go along with the base station though, those messages will get sent, sure, but they have to continue to make it downstream and downstream and downstream to get out to the end user that we're looking to communicate with. The way it gets out from there is the antenna sends off the signal and it keeps bouncing off those repeaters on other towers and on other antennas, and it just keeps getting sent out in an effort to, for the most part, cover our service area. The way that these function and the way we are allowed to use radios is governed by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They set the rules and standards about how much power these antennas can transmit. They set rules on what we can say and how we can use the radios, where we can use them. But really, the thing to know is the base station sends out and receives messages. The repeaters are what bounce it down the system so that it can get out to the next form of communication. We have mobile radios. Mobile radios are any radio that is mounted in a vehicle, anything that is mobile. They are lower powered than a base station. They have about a 10 to 15 mile range, so it means they have to be within 10 or 15 miles of one of those repeaters in order to send and receive messages. If your mobile radio is not within 10 or 15 miles of some sort of repeater that it can use, your ability to use that radio will be very limited. Of note, most of these mobile radios generally have to have some ability to have a bit of line of sight as well for that repeater. Not that they have to actually be able to see it, but there has to be sort of a direct, unhindered path from the mobile radio to that repeater. So things like terrain, being way down in a valley or way up on a mountain, or if you're down in Boston in the Longwood area and surrounded by tall buildings, mobile radios mounted in a vehicle generally don't work altogether that well. A lot of the times you can pick up the radio message that's been sent out, but transmitting back from, the concrete jungle that's down in Boston is really, really kind of difficult to get the message to go back out. Some of the limitations that we talk about as far as how our mobile radios and portable radios work are generally closed off pretty well by cell phones. Radio is something that everyone still uses. Everyone. Police, fire, EMS, we're all still pretty radio heavy. But at the end of the day, if my radio isn't working or I am somewhere where I can't get a message either in or out on my radio, I have other means of communication. Moving down the list from mobile radios, we'll talk portable radios. Portable radios are person portable. These are ones that you will carry. The range on these is very, very limited. You have to be close to some form of repeater, something that can grab that signal and amplify it in order to send it back to the base station where our radio message originated. And if we're not, this radio is about as good as useless. Trying to get in touch with people on a portable radio in, say, like an elevator or even in a large concrete building is going to be difficult. We can contact medical control for medical direction on our portable radios or in our mobile radios, but there are some limitations with them, say as, maybe the hospital doesn't have a radio. When you guys are finished up and out there running the streets of Everett in an ambulance, you'll have a medical resource hospital, you'll have medical control, you'll have medical direction, and to a certain degree, you'll be able to reach them with just the touch of a button. Whether it's on a radio or on a cell phone really doesn't make altogether that much of a difference. So we talked about repeaters needing to be close by. They need to be close by because they will pick up those low-powered signals that our mobile radios or our portable radios are sending off, and actually amplify that and boost it so that it can be sent back across other repeaters, just like the base station does, in order to get it back. Communication can't only be one way, because if I send a message, the only way I know if you received it is if you tell me that you received it, which is why after the first lecture today, I asked, how did it go? Because I think I'm fantastic. But you guys might have thought that I needed to do something a little different, slow things a little down some. So I asked, and you sent the message back that I wasn't, railroading us and things were going okay. Perfect. We didn't need a repeater for that because we're talking on the internet. But radios The repeaters pick up our low powered signals, bounce them back towards whence they came, and it closes the loop on our communications here. Repeaters don't have to be just fixed to a radio antenna. They can be mobile, they can be sort of roving repeaters located in emergency vehicles that will pick up signals. So Boston EMS is probably one of the examples. I'm pretty sure that they have vehicle mounted repeaters so that, yes, being enclosed in all those buildings doesn't really make your portable radio unusable, because down the end of the street, there's a truck with a repeater in it, so that way my low powered signal can get grabbed by that repeater, boosted up a little bit, and sent back towards the communication center so that we can constantly have that open line of communication. The wave of the future now is digital equipment. Digital equipment, you will probably be pretty familiar with this, depending on what you guys use for sort of reporting software and tracking in the vehicle and stuff like that. Mobile data terminals are mounted in just about all public safety vehicles. They still use a radio most places, but your call information is going to pop up on that screen that is in your vehicle, and it will tell you where you need to go, what time you were sent there. Some of them even have some mapping software integrated with them that will show you sort of the best routes of travel or traffic and things of that nature. And you can actually click your times. You can actually use the mobile data terminal to tell dispatch, I've arrived at scene. We've gotten to the patient. There'll be other buttons in there where you can mark that you're transporting, or it'll help you keep track of when you did things like certain time sensitive treatments. And this is all sort of the wave of the future. Initially, the message is encoded in somewhere like the communication center. So your dispatch center is going to type in all the information and hit transmit, and it's going to get sent out much like a cell phone call as a digital signal to this mobile data terminal. The mobile data terminal receives the message, decodes it, puts it into your call window, and there you have it. You now have everything that you possibly need. Radio licenses are expensive. Most radio communications can only be one person at a time. So these mobile data terminals really will cut down on some expense and some sort of crosstalk and difficulty getting radio transmissions out on a crowded frequency. I worked with people that when they got on the radio, you better pull up a chair because you were going to get news, weather, and sports the minute he pressed that button. When we talk about radio communications, it's supposed to be brief, concise, and to the point. You know, I don't need to know that you left your patient with a nurse whose name was Billie Jean, and she was wearing blue scrubs and had her hair in a ponytail, and they just ate lunch. This was a legitimate daily occurrence for a guy that I used to work with, and he just couldn't break the habit. When we talk about radio use, being the fact that only one person can most of the time use the radio channel at a time, things need to be very, very regimented, very, very to the point, so that other emergency providers who are trying to use that radio channel can also get some information out. The biggest development in all of this is going to be cell phones. Cell phones make communicating with dispatch, with hospitals, with other providers way, way, way simpler, especially with the coverage now and how quickly and how easily and how little gap there is in where you can use a cell phone. You can pretty much reliably make any call you want from anywhere you want, and it's going to work. That's one of the benefits. Some of the disadvantages are, well, let's just call it what it is. if you look at the lady in this picture, right, the female EMT who's got her phone, got her phone pressed up to her ear, what's she got on her hands?
Her gloves that are now dirty, it could
Her
infect the
gloves that are
patient.
now dirty, and she's got that cell phone pressed to her face with dirty gloves touching her face. One of the disadvantages is that's gross. Like, we'll just say, we'll just hit the nail right on the head. That's gross. And most of the time when we're in patient care mode, the gloves go on and that's what we're doing. And nobody thinks, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to touch all of these everything with my dirty gloves on. But you'll see people do it all the time. They reach into their equipment bag with dirty gloves on. They're talking to medical control on the phone with their dirty gloves on. They're doing all sorts of stuff with dirty gloves on. Those are meant to protect you from wet, sticky, and not belonging to you. So the last place I want any of that garbage is on my phone or actually being rubbed into the side of my face. Thank you very much. Some places actually provide cell phones to the truck. So a phone will be in the truck and you don't actually have to use your own personal cell phone. That's not as common because these things get lost, they get broken, they get left places. People generally take better care of their own things. But I would make good and well sure if you're going to, in the commission of your duties, use your own stuff, like your own cell phone and things of that nature, be sure that you take your gloves off before you touch your phone. One of the other big drawbacks to using a cell phone instead of a radio is when you call dispatch looking to speak to one of the communications people, we have people calling in for service. We have other units calling on the radio, calling on the phone. It ties up manpower. The reason radios have remained as popular as they are is because it funnels the information. I can only talk to one person at a time at that point because it's the one person that has keyed the radio at that given moment in time that I am speaking with. So when we use the phone to communicate with the communication center and the emergency dispatch and all that a lot, it ties up manpower and it really makes sort of the two-way conversation a little bit more difficult. Because if I'm on the phone with you, I'm ignoring the radio. If I'm on the radio with them, I'm ignoring you, and I'm not really hearing what anyone is saying to me. And it's, too many pots on the stove at that point, and I'm all out of hands. So patience is a virtue when it comes to communication. Just because you can't necessarily get what you're looking to get out on the radio right away, say, you're at a patient's house, you've provided the basic care that you can, you're getting ready to transport, and you can't tell dispatch that you're transporting. This isn't a big deal. You're still transporting. If you're a couple seconds late because you had to wait for somebody to finish giving news, weather, and sports on the radio frequency, okay, you're still doing what's right for the patient. So a couple of seconds here and there, unless it has something to do with, scene safety, not a huge issue. So now we're going to talk some ground rules for actually using the radio. Your communication center is probably only going to be monitoring and transmitting on one frequency. So first and foremost, if you want any of the words that are going to leave you to actually be heard, you got to make sure you're on the right channel. Listen before transmitting is a big one. There may be somebody on the air giving other information. And if you just key up the button on your microphone to begin transmitting while they're still talking, it's entirely possible that you could jam the whole frequency and they could be on the phone screaming, they could be on the radio screaming for help. So make sure the airwaves are clear before you start talking, before you start getting ready to transmit. Next on the list, push the press to talk button and then wait. If you just push that button and begin chattering right away, you cut off the beginning portions of what you're saying. If you don't give that a minute for that radio wave to actually leave your radio, get to the repeater, and get to the base station, nobody's going to know who's calling. Nobody's going to know who it is that's talking to them. And it could lead in a delay for you getting what it is that you're actually asking for, because then the dispatcher communicator is going to have to ask, who is this and what is it that you're looking for, just because that 1 or 2 seconds wasn't waited. Next is probably being someone who worked in a communication center for a really long time. This was maybe my biggest pet peeve of all. The microphone does not need to be in your mouth when we're talking. Microphones actually work a whole lot better if they're a couple of inches away from your face when you're speaking. And just speak normal. You don't need to yell, please don't mumble, but don't have the radio like in your face talking like this, because I won't understand one earthly word that's leaving you. I promise. It's impossible. Just talk normal. Depending on what your SOPs are going to be, you know, maybe you'll identify your unit by the ambulance number. I imagine the first one will probably be Everett Fire Rescue 1 or whatever. Tell me who you are, because I'm sure, I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many pieces of apparatus there are in the city of Everett every day, but I'm sure it's a bunch of them. So if I don't know who it is that's calling, I have to either A, try and figure it out by process of elimination, or if it's a busy day, I really just have no idea who it is that I'm speaking with. After you identify yourself, wait a second and make sure you were heard. Again, speaking as someone who worked in communications, I'm going to answer you. I'm going to tell you, go ahead or stand by. As far as keep your transmission briefs, only tell me what I need to know. I'm not going to make patient care judgments or decisions for you on the dispatch line. So tell me, we've arrived on scene. Okay, I know to click ambulance 1 has arrived on scene. We're transporting. Okay, I know to click ambulance 2 as transporting. You know, you don't need to tell the comms folks every last thing under the sun when you're operating in an ambulance. I know, obviously, when you guys are working on an engine, those rules probably change a little bit, because when, you know, it's fire ground and things like that, people are going to ask you, what's it look like? What's going on? And you need to actually be able to have that bit of conversation and tell them the answer to their question. But most of the time when you're talking with dispatch, it's really short, yes, no, one or two words. And I will get the point, I promise. Stay organized and to the point. That is really the word of the day here. Just make sure that what it is that you're telling me are the things that you need me to know, because I am not the person on scene caring for the patient. So I don't need to know about patient care kinds of stuff. If you are on, say here in Cataldo, when you guys are out doing your ride time and you start operating the radio and whatnot, numbers a lot of the times will sound the exact same, especially in a loud communication center with a lot of stuff going on. 33, 23, 43, they all sort of ring the same. So ambulance 33, 33 or 23, 23 is really going to be helpful to the people who are picking up the radio on the other end. And then a lot of this other stuff is going to be really just what your standard operating procedure is going to be when you get out to the road. Some places want you to, when dispatch gives you a street address, you know, 123 Main Street. All right, received ambulance 2323, we're headed to 123 Main Street. Perfect. If they don't want you using the echo method, don't. When you get an important piece of information, if you're not using a mobile data terminal, jot it down on something. 123 Main Street for a cardiac arrest in progress. Okay, well, 123 Main Street for a cardiac arrest in progress. We're on our way. We never give personal information over the air. We never use profanity over the air. The FCC can actually pull your license to operate a radio channel if you do either one of those things. Use affirmative and negative instead of yes or no, and always end your communications, whether it's over, received, whatever is, the acceptable lingo for your service. I always ended with received, just because that was sort of how I cut my teeth. So now we're talking about communicating with medical control. So when you're communicating with medical control, they are either a doctor or a resident or someone designated by the doctor or hospital to answer that telephone and provide to you some form of medical direction. What kind of medical direction you're going to receive from them is going to depend on your level of certification. We're all going to be EMT basics. So Everett Fire Ambulance 1 BLS looking for whatever. They want to know your patient's age, sex, and chief complaint at the receiving hospital. They want to know the history of the present illness. They want to know things like their medical history, their mental status, vital signs, physical exam, things that you've done, how your patient responded to those things, and how long it's going to be before you get there. So this is the report that you're going to give to the receiving facility. Now, they don't always want all of that, because most of the places around here want this interaction to be very brief. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they don't really always want us giving every last bit of this information?
Keeping the radio
holds up.
traffic to a minimum.
Yeah, we're keeping the radio traffic to a minimum. If I am giving my report to whoever answers the CMed radio in the hospital and I give them all this stuff, I'm occupying somebody's time, so I'm making all of this take longer. And what do I have to do when I get there to avoid abandoning this patient?
You find somebody with the equal criterias or higher.
And I have to do all of this stuff all over again. You're absolutely right. I have to find somebody to transfer this patient's care to, and they are going to want every last bit of this information in painstaking detail. When I call the hospital to let them know that I'm coming in with somebody, really they want age, sex, chief complaint, and a brief patient status. So I'm en route 5 to 7 minutes out with a 45-year-old male, chief complaint of crushing substernal chest pain, no cardiac history. I have given that person everything they need to prepare for this patient. That's what this radio communication is for. The hospital does not want to see us come walking through the door with, a working cardiac arrest and have never called, because there's a lot of crap that goes on in an emergency room. They won't be happy to see me because they won't be ready for this cardiac arrest that just came strolling through the door. So I'm going to give this report in person, face to face with the patient's nurse. On the radio, I'm going to give the abbreviated version. My unit, my level, age, sex, chief complaint, and what's going on briefly with the patient. All of this stuff here that's on this list is going to go to the person directly, face to face. We're going to have that conversation and that discussion because they need all of that information. They just don't need it on the radio. Now, when we're talking with the doc and we ask them questions and we're looking to get medical control advice or orders or whatever you want to call it, repeat the order back to them word for word. This clears up some of sort of what we were talking about before with the doctor giving you an order that maybe is above your scope of practice, or maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because remember, they're doctors, not EMTs. They're doctors, not paramedics. They don't always know, oh, well, this is what I would do. Okay, but we're not doctors. We can't just on the side of the road do an emergency C-section. We can't just on the side of the road complete a field amputation because somebody's stuck under a train, because we don't have the tools and the protocols and the things in place to accomplish that. So repeat the order back to them. And a lot of times, especially if it's something that they said that you don't particularly, have the highest affinity for, they told you to do something that you think maybe is sort of questionable for you to accomplish it best. When you repeat it back to them, yep, Everett Fire BLS 1, just want to make sure that I got that right. Repeat the order back, and they go, no, that was not good. Hold on, let's change this up a little bit. If you're confused or you think there's something wrong with sort of the interaction you're having with this doctor, ask them to repeat it or ask them for some clarification. Don't be afraid to just question the order, because what I will tell you is saying, well, I just did what the doc told me to, when you knew that it probably wasn't right, isn't going to save you. Ignoring an order that you know to be wrong is probably better. Just make sure you're right. Most of the time they're pretty good about this, but if you get something that's questionable, don't just blindly follow it into the night. Make sure that you didn't misunderstand something, make sure that the doctor didn't misunderstand you, and make sure that everybody is on the same page, because at the end of the day, it's not about who's right and wrong, it's about providing what's best for the patient. When we talk to medical control and get medical direction, we're talking even a bit more directed than, when we talk to dispatch or when we talk to the receiving facility with what we're coming in with. We've already identified ourselves. They already know who we are. We're Everett Fire BLS 1. They want to know what's going on. Why are you calling is the situation. They want a brief patient history, including treatments that you've already done and what it is that they responded with. Like what was their response to the treatment you provided? One of the ones that sticks out to me was we used to have to contact medical control to give an epi auto injector for asthma patients who didn't respond to their albuterol. So, okay, this is Everett Fire BLS 1 calling for medical direction. That's the situation. The background is I have a 15-year-old asthma patient who has max dosed their albuterol with no response. Now we get down to assessment. So I'm going to get subjective and objective findings, some vitals. So I have wheezing in all fields, O2 saturation of 84, and respiratory distress with a rate of 28. Last thing on the list is my recommendation. I would like to give epinephrine via auto injector for my patient who's not responding to their epinephrine. Once I've given them the situation, the background, my assessment, and my recommendation, all they're going to do is say yes or no. Whether they say yes, go ahead and give them the epi because I know it to be right and they know it to be right, or they say no, just occupy and transport with this patient, treat appropriately, and call back if you need anything else. At the end of the day, makes absolutely no difference to me. Absolutely none. Because I know what I needed to do. I called and asked for the medical direction, and whatever medical direction told me at that point was what they thought was best. And I'm still going to transport this patient to the emergency room will be evaluated person to person by a doctor, and all the correct decisions can be made from that point. You know, it's not this big, like, all-encompassing thing when we contact medical control, because we're their eyes and ears. So they need to, and do for the most part, as long as we tell them a good story, we get a good outcome. Now, if you pick up the phone and call medical control and you sound like you don't know what you're talking about, they assume that you don't know what you're talking about. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with jotting down some notes before you get on the phone with them to make sure you lay things out in this fashion and have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, so that when you get on the phone with them, you tell them a good story and they let you provide appropriate care for your patient. But this is something to definitely keep in mind. This is probably not even something that's really going to be anything you're responsible for testing wise, but going forward, to be a good provider, this is something to keep in your back pocket. All right, that was about it for communications, guys. So, like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of heavy lifting in that lecture.